Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
We're continuing our series on how Muslims should approach the Hadith, Dr. Shabir. And last time we looked at how the Quran should be primary in the Muslim mind and as a source of guidance for Muslims. So then the question arises, well, what's the point of Hadith? Do we need Hadith? So that's a question I pose to you now.
Yeah, so if we need hadith for several reasons. One is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is presented in the Quran as a prime commentator on the Quran. In the 16th chapter of the Quran, the 44th verse, the Quran tells him that God has revealed this message to him, لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ, so that you may explain to humankind what has been revealed to them. So you have the Quran and you have the explanation. The Quran comes from God, the explanation comes from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But some of that too would be inspired by God. The Quran says "Ma yantiqu anil hawa" in the 53rd chapter of the Quran, and this is obviously a reference to the Quran. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is speaking, he is, he's not proclaiming something of his own. It's the revelation that is revealed to him from God. But scholars have taken this more generally to think about the generality of the wording, and the generality of the wording seems to indicate that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is not speaking of his own. So let's take his statements to be of worth, and he's an inspired man, inspired by God in general, not only when he is reciting the Quran. Another verse in the 59th chapter of the Quran says, "Ma atakum rasulu fakhudhu." Whatever the messenger has given you, you should take it. وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُ. Whatever he prevents you from or dissuades you from, you should refrain from it. So we Muslim scholars have taken that too as in a general way, though it talked about the division of wealth at the time. The Muslim scholars have taken it to mean, okay, well, whatever the Prophet gives you, take it. Whatever he prevents you from, refrain. So that would include all of his sayings and his instructions and so on. And we don't have any problem with that in principle, because he was an inspired man. He was our guide, our teacher, and so on. After all, God didn't just let his book, appear as a writing in the sky, as writing in the clouds, but he sent a human being with it for a reason. And part of that reason is that he would demonstrate as a human being what does it mean to live this book. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, then is our prime exemplar, prime commentator on the Quran, and he demonstrated for us how to pray, how to fast, all of the things that the Quran is telling us to do. He showed us in detail how these things are to be done.
So Dr. Shabir, we have the Quran, and it tells us some basic things, like, tells us to pray, it tells us to fast, but the details are not there. So I understand that we get those details from the Hadith then.
That's right. So the hadiths tell us how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, prayed, or how he instructed Muslims to pray and to fast and to give zakat and so on, the mandatory charity in Islam. So the Quran mentions some times of prayer which are slightly vague, but the Prophet, peace be upon him, demonstrated, okay, this is the time of the morning prayer, this is the time of the soon afternoon prayer, this is the time of the late afternoon prayer, this time soon as night falls, and then late night and so on. He demonstrated that. The Quran speaks about bowing and prostrating, but how many bowings and prostrations would you have in a typical prayer? The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, demonstrated that through his life example. So the Muslims copied him in praying like that, and eventually people wanted to remember exactly, okay, so we know what we're doing as a community. This is the living tradition. How much of this living tradition actually goes back to what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said and did? So they try to document that in the form of hadith. So we get both the hits and the misses. Okay, we were right in this one because somebody remembers that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did it this way or said it this way, and we are probably wrong in this thing, and we need to modify because somebody remembers that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said it this way or that way. And sometimes the dynamic is different in that whatever the community is doing is not only contrary to what people have remembered to be what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said or did, but it is thought to be so right that we will continue doing this and consider that what people remember might be misremembered. So you might have, for example, in the Tirmidhi's collection of hadith, that it is said that this is what is reported. but the practice is this, and this is the correct practice. So they maintain the correct practice. Or Imam Malik is even more known for this, that he will say in his Muwatta, this is his collection of hadith, he will say that this is the practice of the people of Medina, and because this is where the Prophet, peace be upon him, lived and spent the last years of his life, and the community blossomed around him, this must be the community that knows and practices what the Prophet, peace be upon him, left behind. So that must be the correct practice, regardless of what somebody is narrating in the form of a hadith, that one person told another one who told another one.
So Dr. Shabir, what about the fact that, you know, there are certain things that Muslims do, for example, the adhan, the call to prayer, or performing wudu, or the acts of prayer, and there are different versions included within the hadith. So, for example, let's take wudu, for example. It might say to wash, that the Prophet washed each body part once. And then there might be another hadith that says he washed them twice. And then another that says he washed them thrice. So how do Muslims understand that? If the hadith are supposed to be the source of explanation of the Quran, but then there are different versions of hadith reports.
Yeah, so naturally Muslim scholars try to save all of these hadiths by giving interpretations that will blend them together or make room for each other. So for example, in this case, once, twice, three times, we can say, okay, maybe on some occasions the Prophet washed once, sometimes he washed twice, sometimes three times. And so all of this is permissible for Muslims. So generally we wash three times, but if you wanted to wash only once, then, you know, that's okay too. So we can bring about interpretations like this. Sometimes the interpretations seem rather strained, however. It looks like there really is a tension. People have remembered differently and the memories are in conflict. And no reasonable interpretation will actually salvage all of the reports. And we have to admit that something is wrong with the memories of people, which is not wrong. It's just human nature, how we are. We don't remember things so exactly. And so we have really different memories of people, and some things are strikingly so, and we must mention them because those who want to emphasize the hadith, sometimes to the detriment of the Quran, will pretend that the hadiths are all so accurate, these people were so good memorizers, and Imam Bukhari is such a good sifter of hadith that what he has declared to be authentic, it must be so, and so we must absolutely take it. But we can see that people have actually misremembered some things. So things which were done publicly, like you mentioned the adhan, there shouldn't be different versions of the adhan because it's you know, something that was done publicly. Every kid
5
heard
times
it.
a day.
And yes, so often. What must be borne in mind as well is that these narratives were related from generally an older person to a younger person, because we want to minimize the chain of narrators. The more narrators you have, the more possibility of error, and everybody recognizes this. This is why we might speak of a golden chain, al-silsilatu zahabiyya, the golden chain, which consists of only 3 persons, you know, who are of the most upright character. Because the least persons you have, the less possibility of error. But how do you get the least persons? By a young person going to an old person, getting the information. So like, for example, somebody getting it from his grandfather when his grandfather is in old age. And this young man then lives on to a ripe old age and then passes it on to his grandson. So this is how we get fewer persons. But when you think about this, when you think of the grandfather who lived through the whole life with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, maybe he started out as a young person, he now lived to a ripe old age. At his ripe old age, he's saying something. Now, he must be saying something that is already known to the community, things that have been talked about, debated, discussed among people. It's not that you can't have the situation where one person knows one aspect and the other person knows the other aspect. And often what we have in hadith is that we have 2 conflicting reports, and in order to bring them together, we must assume that one person is telling us the one aspect and the other person is telling us the other aspect. But so you're asking, why wasn't it harmonized right within the lifetime of the grandfather who told his grandson this bit of information? Why is one grandfather telling only one aspect and the other grandfather telling his grandson the other aspect? Both grandfathers should know the whole story and tell the whole story, even in the summary form, but you shouldn't have this kind of conflict that is often there in the narratives, as we will see as we discuss various subject matters on which the hadiths are in a hopeless conflict with each other.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome. The most effective and far-reaching dawah we can do these days is on social media. That's why we're developing the Muslim Media Hub. We're harnessing the power of media to spread the message of Islam. Please support this project at QuranSpeaks.com and share in the reward from God.